Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 in this series for creating realistic materials in Blender's Viewport with GLSL shading. And the first thing that I want to do is correct a mistake that I made in the first video. So in the node editor with the node group selected, I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode. And I'm going to switch these two materials around so that now the sharp reflection is on the outside and the blurry reflection is on the inside, which is more physically accurate. But switching those nodes did create a problem that we need to fix now. So in order to see it, let's just go ahead and move the output node down, and we'll plug the Glossy Shader directly into it. Okay, so now at a roughness value of 0, the texture is blurry, and so it's reversed. So we just need to switch that around. And the way that we can do that is just by making some adjustments to the math nodes. So let's select this node and press Tab to go into edit mode. And now the math nodes on each side of the color ramp just need to be switched to multiply. And now I want to customize that roughness slider. So I can do that by pressing N to bring up my options here. And then under the input category, I can choose roughness. And then I want to change the start and end values here. So I'll set the start value to 0 and the end value to 1. Because by default it was set to -10,000 to 10,000. So it's just, there's a lot of range in there that we don't really need. Now 0 is completely sharp reflection and 1 is the rough glossy reflection. Okay, just a couple more things I want to do before we move on to the next material. The first of which is I want to change the name of this node group. So currently it's just called node group. So right here under properties, I'm going to change the name to Glossy Shader. And that updates on the node as well. And then finally, the last thing that I want to do is I want a normal map input on the outside of the node group. So I'll tab to go into edit mode. And then, so we have our geometry node going into the texture that holds the normal map and into the normal map node. So what we need is we need the color input on the normal map node plugged into our input node. And that's created a new input here. And we can change the name of this to normal. Then use this little up arrow to bump that up above the normal strength input. And now if I tab out of edit mode, we can see that we have this new input on our glossy shader. And the normal map texture is gone from our model, so we have to re-add that in. So I'll type Shift A and go to Geometry. And then Shift A again and choose Input Texture. And in that texture node, I'll select that normal map. And we can use the UV coordinates and plug the color of that texture into the normal input. And now we have our normal map back. And since we've finished our glossy shader, we can use it as a base or a start to create our next material, which is the Anisotropic Shader. And a few weeks ago I was in an IKEA and I was looking at all of these different appliances which are made from stainless steel, and I was thinking of how I would recreate this anisotropic effect in the viewport. And unfortunately there's no physically based way of doing this, so instead we need to do some tricks with some textures and reflections, and we'll be using the glossy shader that we just created to try to simulate this effect in different materials. And most often we see this stainless steel type material in the kitchen. So for this example, I've created this little cooking pot to apply this anisotropic shading to. And I've already UV unwrapped it for the purpose of adding a normal map. So I'll go to my default scene. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to import that glossy shader that we created earlier. So I can just go to File and Append, then find the blend file, and then open Node Tree, and then choose Glossy Shader. And I'll append. And so I've already created this material. So if I click Use Nodes down here, or this little Use Nodes tab, we can now see our nodes in the node editor. Okay, so I can just delete that material and then type Shift A and go to Group and then choose Glossy Shader. That again is only there because we've appended it. And I'll just plug it directly into the output node and switch the color back to white. Okay, and also these types of anisotropic materials are usually really rough in their reflection, so I'll take the roughness all the way up to 1. Okay guys, sorry, I moved to a quieter space because they're doing some construction where I was before. So now let's just type Shift A and add our geometry node, and then Shift A again and our input texture node. And we'll just connect these up using the UV coordinates. And I've already imported a normal map that I want to use, so I can just open it up here in the drop-down box. And I chose a very subtle normal map because I don't want it to look old and beaten up. I just wanted a little bit of variation on the surface of the object. Just something to interact with those reflections. Alright, so now let's add the anisotropic effect. And in order to do that, we need to create a new material. And I'll just call this one anisotropic. And we need to add a new texture, but we don't have a texture yet. We need to create it. I'm going to use GIMP. You can use whatever photo editing or paint software that you have, that you prefer. And I'll just go to File and create a new image, and I'll use this default size. And I'll use the paint can to fill it to all black. Then I'll choose the rectangle select, and I'll select about 1/3 of the image. And then choose this gradient tool and change the gradient type. I select this option all the way down at the bottom. It's called here, it's rounded edge. And the rest of these options I think look fine. So now if I drag the gradient from one side to the other, I create this sort of blurred line. Now I'll use the rectangle select again and select another portion of it. I don't want to select the whole other, 2/3 of the image. Maybe just a little area here in between. And that should look good. I'll just drag this from one end to the other, and this one will be a little wider. And I think that this will probably work. So I'll just get rid of that selection, and then I can export this image. And I'll just call this anisotropic, and then change it to a JPEG so that it's a smaller file size. Then click Export. And now we're finished in GIMP. So let's close this. And now we can add that image to our anisotropic material. Okay, and we'll switch it from the default coordinates from UV to reflection. Now let's go back to our node material, and we'll type Shift A and go to Input and add that material node. And from the drop-down box, we will just select the anisotropic. And now we need to mix it with that glossy shader. So we can just type Shift A and go to Color and choose Mix RGB. And then just connect them together. and change the mix type from mix to add. And then of course take the factor all the way up. So now we have the anisotropic effect working, but there's still one more thing that we need to do, and that's with the specularity. Because these are, after all, supposed to represent the reflection of light. So if the light in your scene increases, so should that anisotropic effect. So let's select the anisotropic material and then go to that texture. And in addition to the diffuse color being checked, we also need to check these three options under specular. And now, again, what will happen is if we go to our lamp and we increase the energy, then the anisotropic shading, or that reflection of light, should increase as well. Okay, and it's working fine. So I think that we're done now with our anisotropic material. One thing I will mention, though, that if you've ever actually been to an IKEA, you know that it is full of really bright lights on the ceiling and all around. So you probably wouldn't need so many streaks of light to represent this anisotropic material. In the case of a normal kitchen, fewer would probably look better. Alright, so now let's move on to our next material, which is the velvet shader. And in Cycles, the velvet shader has two options, two ways of customizing. The first of which is the color, and I'll just change this to red, because for some reason when I think of velvet, I think of red. Perhaps I'm thinking of the cake, but I don't know. And the other option is the sigma. The sigma appears to change the surface or the roughness or the way that light reflects on the surface. But the word sigma isn't really pertaining to a property having to do with velvet specifically. The word sigma, it just indicates a mathematical value. It's actually the 18th letter in the Greek alphabet, and it's a symbol that's often used in math. Again, just to represent a value. So now let's take a look at how we can recreate the shader in GLSL. So let's begin the way that we should for all of our materials, at least in Blender Render or the Blender Game Engine. And by the way, you know, I've been doing this in Blender Render, but you can also do this in Blender Game Engine. Either one will support these types of GLSL materials. And of course we need to change our shading type, so press N to bring up your options and come down to shading and change it from multi-texture to GLSL. And under display I'll check only render to get rid of those lines. But first of all, let me actually move the lamp out in front of Suzanne so that we can actually sort of illuminate the scene a little more and see our material. Okay, so now I can switch from solid to textured view. And we'll give Suzanne a new material. And I'll just call this Velvet. And now I'll open the node editor. And then I want to use the node, so I can either click Use Nodes or this little Use Nodes tab. And then in the material node, I'll just open the material that says Velvet. And the first thing I'm going to do is change the color of the material, but rather than do it from the color input on the material node, instead we're going to add a Mix RGB node. So I'll type Shift A and go to Color, Mix RGB, and I'll plug that directly into the color slot. And now, just like before in Cycles, I'm going to change the color to red. And then the second color is going to represent the sigma. So that's going to be black, but I don't want to make it completely black. I'll bring it up just slightly. Maybe a value of 0.002 for the red, green, and blue should be fine. And now we'll create that series of nodes that we've been using so frequently, the geometry node and the vector normal node and the color ramp. And somebody asked me why I don't just take the Fresnel node from Cycles and use it in the Blender game engine or in Blender internal. There is a reason why, and I'm going to discuss this probably when I get to the glass shader. But not all Cycles nodes work as you would expect them to, because they're not all unified. So they work differently in Cycles than they would in different render engines like the Blender game engine or Blender internal. But we will discuss that more later. For now, let's drag this black value about 3/4 of the way up. And then we will need a way to control the strength of the sigma. And in order to do that, we need to use a math node. So let's move these 3 nodes out a bit. And we can now just type Shift A and go to Converter Math. And we'll keep this at add. And by lowering the value, it will decrease that surface difference. And by increasing it, it will add that black value into the material. But I don't really like the blend type that it's using, so I'll switch this from linear to B-spline, which I use quite often because I think it has a more gradual transition and it looks a little more natural. And now our material is almost finished with one exception, in that it looks a little plastic right now. And that's because of the color of the specularity. Because velvet actually, the color of the light that reflects on the surface is typically the color of the material itself. So let's figure out a way to do this now. We're going to create a node group by just box selecting all of these with B and type Control G, and that puts them all in a group. And now we can work on our inputs for the shader. So we'll take the group input, and the first thing that we'll plug into it is the color on the Mix Rgb node, the first color, which is the color of the velvet itself. We'll just plug that in, and it's already called color in the input, so I think that's fine. And the second input will be this value on the add math node. So we'll plug that in, and this will be the sigma. So we can just switch this from, we'll rename it sigma. And so now we need a way to be able to change the color of the velvet material and the specularity together at once. So this wire that connects the color to the input node, we'll just hold Shift and left mouse button and drag that through the wire, and that creates a rerouter. So now we can drag the wire from the rerouter into the color of the specularity. And that looks like a more realistic velvet material. So now let's tab out of this and we'll take a look at our node group. So if we take a look at our material and we change the color, we can quickly change the color of the velvet and the specularity together at once. And we also have this sigma value, which appears to change the surface roughness, or the way that light reflects on the surface. And it all seems to be working very well. So again, we're finished with this material. One more thing that we can do is, of course, change the name of our material shader. So over here under Properties, I'll just switch this from Node Group to Velvet Shader. And again, that updates it on the node, and we're finished. And so that's it for part 2. And in part 3, we will work on creating more of these materials in GLSL. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.